The massive space station hung against the darkness of space like a giant metal spider web. Countless ships, both broken and whole, floated around it, tied to its docking arms by magnetic tethers. This was the Imperial Fleet's cemetery, where ships came to die. Among these forgotten vessels floated the Thunder's Edge, its once proud hull now covered in space dust. 10 years ago, it had been the pride of the fleet. Now it was just another piece of junk waiting to be taken apart for scrap metal. Jack Reed stood at the observation window, his rough hands pressed against the cold glass. His eyes never left the Thunder's Edge, as it slowly spun in the emptiness of space. Other mechanics walked past him, some giving him strange looks, others completely ignoring him. They all knew about his odd request to Admiral Mills earlier that day. "You want to buy that heap of junk?" The Admiral had laughed, his perfect uniform making Jack's oil-stained coveralls look even shabbier. "Did you hit your head during maintenance duty, Reed?" But Jack hadn't laughed. He'd stood there, holding out his credit chip containing every credit he'd saved over 15 years of service. "Yes, sir. I want to buy the Thunder's Edge." The Admiral's amusement had turned to irritation. "That ship is scheduled for dismantling. It's not for sale. Sir, with respect, it's been sitting here for 3 years. Nobody wants its parts. The crystal core is considered outdated. Let me take it off your hands." Now, hours later, Jack watched his dream floating in space, wondering if he'd made a mistake by pushing so hard. Behind him, he heard the heavy boots of other mechanics approaching. "Look who it is, the human who thinks he can fix what our best engineers couldn't," one of them said. The others laughed. Jack ignored them. His eyes caught a flicker of light from deep within the Thunder's Edge, a pulse from its crystal core that nobody else seemed to notice. He'd seen that same pulse many times over the past months when he was supposed to be working on other ships. There was something about it that didn't match any of the diagnostic reports. The station's intercom crackled to life. "Mechanic Reed, report to Admiral Mills' office immediately." More laughter followed him as he walked away from the window. The corridors of the station were cold and gray, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Jack's footsteps echoed as he made his way to the administrative section, leaving behind the familiar smells of engine oil and plasma coolant. The Admiral's office door slid open before he could knock. Inside, Mills sat behind his desk, looking at a holographic display of the Thunder's Edge. "Sit down, Reed," he said without looking up. Jack sat, his hands folded in his lap to hide their nervous movement. "I've reviewed your service record," Mills said. 15 years. Not a single disciplinary mark. Your repair success rate is among the highest on the station." He finally looked up. "You're either brilliant or insane. The board thinks it's the latter." Jack started to speak, but Mills held up his hand. "However," he continued, "that ship has been taking up valuable space for 3 years. The cost of dismantling it is more than its parts are worth." He pushed a data pad across the desk. "Sign this. It releases the fleet from any liability when that wreck falls apart around you. It's yours for the price you offered." Jack's hands trembled as he picked up the pad. He pressed his thumb to the scanner, trying to keep his face professional, even as joy surged through him. "One condition," Mills added. "When it breaks down completely, you'll admit I was right about it being worthless." "In writing." Jack stood and saluted. "Thank you, sir, but I don't think you'll ever get that letter." As he walked back through the station, heading toward his new ship, Jack felt the stares and heard the whispers. Let them talk. He'd seen something in that crystal core pulse that nobody else had noticed. The Thunder's Edge wasn't dead. It was just waiting for someone who could understand what it was trying to say. He reached the observation window again and looked at his ship, with pride. Tomorrow, he would begin bringing it back to life. And then he would show them all exactly how wrong they'd been. Jack's boots made hollow sounds as he walked through the empty corridors of Thunder's Edge. His footsteps echoed off the metal walls, mixing with the soft hum of the backup power systems he'd managed to start up. The air was stale, but breathable thanks to the small atmospheric recycler he brought aboard. He stopped at the entrance to the main engine room. The giant crystal core sat in the center, covered in years of dust. Most people saw it as outdated technology, replaced by newer plasma drives. But Jack saw something different. He walked closer, wiping away layers of grime from the crystal's surface with his sleeve. "Let's figure out what makes you special," he muttered, pulling out his handheld scanner. The device was old, something he built himself from spare parts. Unlike the fleet's standard equipment, it could detect energy patterns that most scanners ignored. The crystal flickered weakly, responding to the scanner's probe. Jack's eyes widened as he watched the readings. "That's impossible," he whispered. The energy wasn't flowing the way the manual said it should. Instead of pushing straight through the crystal like a normal power core, the energy was spinning in complex patterns. He spent the next few hours crawling through maintenance tunnels, checking connections and power lines. Everything he found went against what he'd learned in training. The alien engineers had tried to force the crystal to work like a standard power core, but that wasn't how it was designed to operate. Jack sat on the engine room floor, surrounded by old maintenance logs and technical diagrams. He'd been reading them for hours, looking for clues. His eyes were tired, and his back hurt from sitting on the hard floor. But he couldn't stop. There was something here, something everyone else had missed. They were trying to push when they should have been pulling, he said to himself, studying the crystal structure. The alien engineers had tried to force energy through the crystal in a straight line. But the crystal's natural patterns were circular, like water flowing in a river. Jack stood up and walked to the main control panel. His hands shook slightly as he started typing in new commands. He wasn't following the manual anymore. Instead, he was following the crystal's own patterns, letting it work the way it wanted to. The crystal's glow brightened slightly. The hum of power changed its tone, becoming smoother, more natural. Jack held his breath as he watched the energy readings. They were higher than anything in the records, and he was only using a fraction of the power the old engineers had used. A loud bang echoed through the ship as old systems started coming back to life. Lights flickered on in sequence down the corridors. The air handlers started working, pushing out the stale air. Jack laughed out loud, his voice bouncing off the walls. He ran to the bridge, his boots clanging on the metal floor. The main console was lighting up, systems checking in one after another. The ship was waking up, stretching like someone coming out of a long sleep. "I knew you weren't dead," he said, patting the console. The ship hummed around him, its energy readings climbing higher and higher. They were already past what the fleet engineers had called the ship's maximum power level, and the crystal was still only operating at 30% capacity. Jack started running more tests, his fingers flying over the controls. Each test showed the same thing. Thunder's Edge wasn't obsolete. It had just been misunderstood. The crystal didn't need to be forced to work. It needed to be guided, like a partner in a dance. As the day cycle ended on the station outside, Jack was still working. He didn't notice the curious looks from passing ships or the way the station's sensors were registering power levels they'd never seen before. He was too busy unlocking the ship's secrets, one system at a time. The crystal's blue glow filled the engine room, pulsing like a heartbeat. Thunder's Edge was more than just a ship now. It was a discovery that would change everything. Jack just didn't know how big that change would be. The emergency alarms on the station blared to life, their harsh sound cutting through the quiet of space. Jack looked up from his work on Thunder's Edge, his hands covered in grease and crystal dust. Through the viewports, he could see repair ships rushing back to the station. Emergency broadcasts filled every channel. Alert! Mining Colony Beta 7 under attack. All Imperial ships respond. Repeat. Mining Colony Beta 7 under attack. Jack switched on the ship's main viewer. The screen flickered to life, showing scenes from the colony. Strange ships filled the sky above the mining outpost. They looked like metal insects, their hulls shifting and changing shape as they moved. The swarm had finally reached this sector. He watched as Imperial battleships arrived at the colony. Their weapons seemed useless against the swarm ships. Energy blasts hit invisible barriers and faded away. Torpedoes exploded harmlessly against shield walls that appeared and disappeared like soap bubbles. "The shields," Jack muttered, moving closer to the screen. "They're not staying in one place." He could see it now. The swarm's defenses weren't fixed. They flowed and changed like water, always moving to where they were needed most. A loud pulse from the engine room caught his attention. The crystal core was reacting to something. Jack ran back, his footsteps echoing through the empty ship. The crystal's glow had changed, pulsing in time with the swarm ship's shield frequencies he'd just seen on the screen. "You can see it too, can't you?" he said to the crystal. He pulled out his scanner, checking the energy patterns. The crystal wasn't just copying the swarm's shield frequency, it was finding gaps in it, places where the shields were weakest. Jack worked through the night, ignoring the chaos on the station outside. More reports came in of swarm attacks on other colonies. The Imperial fleet was losing ships faster than they could be replaced. But Jack barely heard the reports. He was too focused on what the crystal was showing him. The next morning, Admiral Mills called an emergency meeting. Jack watched it on his ship's viewer, still working on the crystal's controls. The Admiral looked tired, his uniform not as perfect as usual. "The swarm's shields adapt to all our weapons," Mills told the gathered officers. "Our best scientists can't find a way through them. We're asking all stations to begin evacuation preparations." Jack looked at his latest test results. The crystal had shown him something incredible. The swarm's shields weren't just energy barriers. They were alive, growing and changing like the ships themselves. And like all living things, they had a natural rhythm. He ran more tests, pushing the crystal to generate different energy patterns. Each time, the crystal responded perfectly, creating waves that could match and counter the swarm's shield frequencies. But the power needed was enormous. No standard ship could generate enough energy to break through those shields. But Thunder's Edge wasn't a standard ship anymore. Outside the ship, Jack could see the station preparing for possible evacuation. Supply ships were being loaded, defense systems checked and rechecked. Everyone was scared, even if they tried not to show it. Jack looked at his ship's power readings again. The crystal core was only using half its potential energy, and it was already matching the power output of 3 normal battleships. If he could push it further, tune it more precisely. A new alarm sounded. A swarm scout ship had been spotted near the station. The evacuation orders turned urgent, but Jack didn't run to the escape pods like the others. Instead, he started powering up Thunder's Edge's systems. "Time to show them what you can really do," he said, his hand steady on the controls despite his racing heart. The crystal core pulsed brighter, as if agreeing with him. They might only be one ship, but sometimes one ship was all you needed, if it was the right ship. The swarm scout ship moved through space like a giant metal wasp, its surface rippling with living metal. Station sensors tracked its approach as people rushed to evacuation points. But inside Thunder's Edge, Jack sat calmly at the controls, watching the enemy ship through his view screen. He hadn't asked for permission to launch. There wasn't time, and no one would have given it anyway. The docking clamps were still attached to his ship, holding it in place. Jack looked at the release controls, knowing that pushing that button would either make him a hero or get him arrested. He pushed it. Thunder's Edge broke free from the station, its crystal core humming with power. On the station's command deck, alarms went off as unauthorized launch was detected. Admiral Mills' voice came through the radio, angry and sharp. "Reed, what do you think you're doing? Return to dock immediately." Jack ignored the command, focusing instead on the swarm scout. It had noticed him now, turning to face the approaching ship. Its shields flickered to life, rippling like heat waves in summer air. "Let's see if we're right about this," Jack said quietly, powering up the weapon systems he'd modified. The crystal core pulsed faster, matching its rhythm to the swarm ship's shield frequency. The scout ship attacked first, sending a blast of energy toward Thunder's Edge. Jack didn't try to dodge. Instead, he watched his screens as the crystal core automatically adjusted its output, creating a counter-frequency that made the enemy's shot dissipate harmlessly. From the station, voices called out in surprise. They'd never seen a ship survive a direct hit from a swarm weapon before, but Jack wasn't listening. He was too busy preparing his own attack. The crystal core's energy flowed through the weapons in waves, building and falling like ocean tides. When Jack fired, the blast looked different from normal weapons. Instead of a straight beam, it was a spiral of energy that spun through space. The swarm ship's shields came up to block it, but Jack's modified weapons weren't trying to break through the shields. They were matching them, joining their rhythm, then changing it. The shields wavered, became unstable, and finally collapsed. A second shot from Thunder's Edge struck the now defenseless scout ship. The hit wasn't particularly powerful, but it didn't need to be. Without its adaptive shields, the swarm ship was vulnerable. It broke apart, its living metal surface going dark and lifeless. Silence filled the radio channels. On the station, people stood at windows, watching as pieces of the swarm scout drifted through space. No one had ever destroyed a swarm ship so easily before. Admiral Mills' voice came back on the radio, softer now. "Reed, how did you do that?" Jack looked at his readings, making sure everything was properly recorded. "The crystal core, sir. It can match the swarm's shield frequencies. Their defenses aren't just technology. They're alive, like the ships themselves, and living things can be understood if you learn their patterns." He turned Thunder's Edge back toward the station, the crystal core's power humming smoothly through the ship. As he approached, he could see crews gathering at the observation windows, watching his return. "Request permission to dock." "Admiral," Jack said formally, knowing he was in trouble for the unauthorized launch. But he also knew things had changed. They'd all seen what his worthless ship could do. There was a long pause before Mills responded. "Permission granted. And Reed, report to my office immediately upon docking. Bring your technical data. All of it." As Jack guided his ship back to its berth, he smiled slightly. The Admiral's voice had that tone he'd heard before, the one that meant someone's entire understanding of what was possible had just been changed. Behind him, the crystal core pulsed steadily, its light filling the ship with a soft blue glow. They'd proven themselves today, both the ship and its human pilot. But Jack knew this was just the beginning. The swarm was still out there, and now they knew someone could hurt them. The lab buzzed with activity as Imperial scientists crowded around Thunder's Edge's crystal core. Jack stood to the side, watching as Dr. Blake, the lead researcher, ran another series of tests. They'd been at this for days, trying to understand how the ship had defeated the swarm scout. "It doesn't make sense," Dr. Blake muttered, checking his readings again. "The power output is far beyond what this crystal type should be capable of." He turned to Jack with frustrated eyes. "What did you do to it?" Jack walked over to the control panel, his work boots loud against the lab's clean floor. "I didn't force it to do anything. That was the problem all along. Everyone was trying to make it work like a normal power core." He pulled up his original scan results on the main screen. The scientists gathered around, watching as he showed them the crystal's natural energy patterns. "See these circles? The crystal wants to spin its energy, not push it straight through. It's like a dancer, not a soldier." Dr. Blake frowned at the display. "But our best engineers tried for years to make this technology work. How did you figure it out?" Jack shrugged. "I just listened to what the ship was telling me. Humans are good at seeing patterns that don't fit the rules." As if to prove his point, the crystal core pulsed brightly. The Imperial sensors screamed warnings about power spikes, but Jack calmly adjusted a few controls. The readings returned to normal, the crystal's glow settling into a steady rhythm. "That's another thing," Dr. Blake said, pointing to Jack's hands on the controls. "When our engineers try to do that, the system overloads. But you make it look easy. Try it again, Jack suggested. But this time, don't think about what the manual says. Watch the crystal's patterns and match them. The scientist stepped up to the controls, his hands hovering over them uncertainly. Jack guided him through the process, showing him how to feel the crystal's rhythm. But every time Dr. Blake tried to adjust the power flow, the system became unstable. After the fifth failed attempt, Dr. Blake stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead. There's something different about how you interact with it. We need to run brain scans while you're operating the controls. The next few hours were uncomfortable for Jack. They attached sensors to his head and hands, making him perform various tasks with the crystal core. Test after test showed the same results. His brain patterns matched the crystal's energy waves in ways the alien scientists' patterns didn't. "It's your neural structure," Dr. Blake finally announced, looking at the results with amazement. "Human brains process patterns differently from our species. You're not just controlling the crystal, you're connecting with it." Jack remembered all the times the ship had seemed to respond to his thoughts before he even touched the controls. Can other humans do it? They brought in different human mechanics and engineers, testing each one's ability to work with the crystal. Some did better than the alien scientists, but none could match Jack's level of control. "It's not just being human," Dr. Blake explained later, showing Jack the combined test results. "It's about instinct and experience, too. You've spent years working with all kinds of ships, learning their quirks. Your brain is trained to see the patterns others miss." Jack looked at the crystal core, its blue light filling the lab. "So what happens now?" "Now," Dr. Blake smiled for the first time in days. "Now we take everything you've taught us and start upgrading other ships. The swarm won't expect an entire fleet of crystal-powered vessels." The scientist paused, looking at Jack seriously. "But Thunder's Edge will still be special. No other ship will have you as its pilot." Outside the lab windows, Jack could see engineers already starting work on other vessels, installing new crystal cores based on his discoveries. The breakthrough they'd been looking for wasn't just in the technology, it was in the human ability to understand it. The capital world's sky turned black with swarm ships. They moved like a cloud of metal insects, blocking out the stars. On the ground, people ran to safety bunkers as defense sirens wailed across the city. In orbit, the Imperial fleet gathered to protect their home. Hundreds of ships formed battle lines, their weapons ready. Among them floated Thunder's Edge, its crystal core glowing brighter than ever before. "You can't fight them alone, Reed," Admiral Mill's voice crackled over the radio. "Stay in formation with the fleet." Jack watched the swarm ships approaching on his screens. Their numbers were greater than anything they'd seen before. "Sir, with respect, Thunder's Edge works better when we can move freely. We need to get close to disrupt their shield patterns." Before the Admiral could argue, the swarm attacked. Their ships moved like a giant wave, washing over the Imperial defense line. Energy beams and torpedoes filled space, but most bounced harmlessly off the swarm's shifting shields. Jack pushed Thunder's Edge forward, breaking formation. The crystal core hummed louder, matching its pulses to the enemy shields. As he flew through the battle, swarm ships near him started losing their protection. "All ships," Admiral Mills commanded, "focus fire on the areas where Reed creates openings." Imperial ships followed Thunder's Edge, their weapons finding targets in the gaps Jack created. Swarm ships began to fall, their living metal bodies breaking apart in space. But for each one they destroyed, two more took its place. The crystal core's light filled Thunder's Edge's corridors as Jack pushed it harder than ever before. He could feel its rhythm matching his own heartbeat as they moved through the fight. Where other ships had to dodge and weave, Thunder's Edge simply flowed between enemy attacks like water around rocks. "Reed." Dr. Blake's voice cut through the battle noise. "The other crystal ships are ready to launch. They're not as powerful as yours, but they can help disrupt the swarm's shields." Jack looked at his rear screens. 5 ships rose from the capital's surface, each one fitted with a new crystal core. Their power readings were lower than Thunder's Edge, but together they could cover more area. "Follow my lead," Jack told their pilots. "Don't fight the crystal's rhythm. Let it guide you." The new ships spread out behind Thunder's Edge like the points of a star. As they moved through the battle, their combined crystal energy created waves that made the swarm's shields flicker and fail. But the enemy was learning. The swarm ships started to change their shield patterns, trying to adapt. Jack felt Thunder's Edge's crystal core pulse in response, automatically adjusting to the new frequencies. "They're attacking the city's shields," someone shouted over the radio. A group of larger swarm ships had broken through, diving toward the capital. Without waiting for orders, Jack turned Thunder's Edge to chase them. The crystal core's power surged as he pushed the ship to its limits. Energy coursed through the weapons, building to levels that made the warning systems scream. "Hold on," Jack whispered, both to his ship and to the people below. The crystal's light became blindingly bright as he fired. The blast that came from Thunder's Edge wasn't like anything they'd seen before. It was a spiral of pure energy that wrapped around the diving swarm ships like a net. Their shields shattered, and the ships themselves began to break apart, their living metal unable to handle the crystal's resonance. In orbit, the battle turned. The other crystal ships followed Thunder's Edge's example, working together to create gaps in the swarm's defenses. Imperial ships poured fire into these openings, destroying enemy vessels by the dozens. The swarm began to retreat, their perfect formation breaking apart. As they fled, Jack let Thunder's Edge float in space, its crystal core slowly cooling down. Below, cheers erupted from the capital city as people emerged from their bunkers. Victory was theirs, but Jack knew this was only the beginning. The swarm would be back, stronger and more adapted than before. But now, they were ready. Humanity had brought something new to the fight. Not just technology, but a new way of using it. 6 months after the battle for the capital, Jack walked through a different scrapyard station. This one orbited a distant mining world, far from the busy fleet bases. His boots left tracks in the dust as he moved between abandoned ships. Things had changed since the swarm attack. Thunder's Edge was now the pride of the fleet, its crystal core technology copied into dozens of new vessels. But none worked quite as well as the original. Jack's ship had become a legend, inspiring a whole new class of hybrid vessels that combined alien crystal technology with human intuition. Admiral Mills had promoted him to chief engineer of the new Crystal Fleet Division. The same people who once laughed at him now came to him for advice. But Jack hadn't changed. He still preferred working with machines to attending fancy meetings. That's why he was here, in this forgotten corner of space, looking for his next project. Something about this old station had caught his attention. The same feeling he'd had when he first saw Thunder's Edge. He stopped in front of an old cargo ship. Its hull was stained and dented, its engines cold and silent. But there was something about it that made him pull out his scanner. "Well, look what we have here," he muttered, studying the readings. Hidden beneath layers of standard equipment was something unusual, patterns he'd never seen before. "I had a feeling you'd find it," a voice said behind him. Jack turned to see Admiral Mills stepping carefully through the dusty corridor. The Admiral looked different now, more relaxed, his uniform slightly less perfect. "Find what, sir?" Jack asked, though he could guess the answer. Mills smiled. That ship was part of a secret project from 30 years ago. Different technology from the crystal cores, but just as mysterious. Our engineers couldn't make it work either. He paused. "Sound familiar?" Jack looked back at the cargo ship. Now he could see it clearly. The subtle differences in its construction, the strange readings from deep within its hull. Another piece of worthless technology, waiting for someone who could understand it. "The paperwork's already done," Mills said, holding out a datapad. "It's yours if you want it, though I won't make you promise to write an apology letter this time." Jack took the pad, already thinking about the tools he'd need. Behind them, footsteps echoed as Dr. Blake approached, followed by a group of young engineers, humans and aliens working together. "The next class is ready to start learning," Dr. Blake said. "We thought they could watch you work on this one from the beginning. See how you think about these problems." Jack nodded. That had been part of the deal. He could keep exploring abandoned technology, but he had to teach others how to see what he saw. Not just the technical details, but the intuition that came from years of listening to machines. The students gathered around as Jack began his initial inspection. He showed them how to look beyond the surface, to feel the rhythms and patterns hidden in alien technology. Some of them would learn to do what he did. Others wouldn't. But all of them would understand that sometimes the most valuable things were the ones others had thrown away. As the day ended, Jack stood at a viewport, watching Thunder's Edge dock at the station. The ship's crystal core pulsed with a soft blue light, as strong and steady as ever. Next to it, his new project waited in darkness. "Ready to start another adventure?" Mills asked, standing beside him. Jack smiled, thinking of all the other abandoned ships and mysterious technologies waiting to be found. The swarm was still out there, and they would need every advantage they could get. "Always ready, sir," he said. "There are still a lot of things out here waiting to be understood. We just have to be willing to listen to what they're trying to tell us." Tomorrow, he would begin bringing another forgotten ship back to life. And maybe, just maybe, he would find something that would change everything again.